Nebraska did not forgive mistakes. That was the first thing Hazel Pruitt learned when she arrived at 22 years old with a dead man's plan folded in her coat pocket and nothing else to recommend her. The land was flat and honest, and it asked everything of you before it gave you anything back. And some mornings it didn't give you anything back at all. It just sat there under a sky so wide it made you feel like something that had been accidentally left out, something the world had not gotten around to putting away yet. She had come in the summer of 1871, following a route her father had drawn on a piece of brown paper at the kitchen table in Ohio. Edwin Pruitt had been a careful man, a man who believed that if you thought hard enough about a thing and planned it out with enough detail, the world would cooperate. He had drawn fence lines that did not exist yet. He had written down distances between water sources. He had calculated how much lumber a man would need to build a house on 160 acres of Nebraska grassland, and he had been off by almost half, which was the kind of mistake a man made when he had never actually built anything with his hands. Edwin Pruitt died of a lung infection outside Council Bluffs before he ever crossed the Missouri River. He died in a rooming house on a Tuesday in April, and by Thursday he was in the ground at a cemetery on the edge of town. And by Friday, Hazel had packed the wagon herself and continued west because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, and the land her father had registered was already paid for, and it was hers now, whether she wanted it or not. Her brother Daniel had turned back at the Nebraska border. He said he was going to find work in St. Joseph. He said he would write. He did not write. Hazel kept going. She was not sure later whether that had been bravery or simply the inability to picture any other option. She had spent 7 years being the person in that Ohio household who managed things, who calculated what was needed and in what order and by how much. Her mother had died when Hazel was 15, a fever that came fast and left nothing behind. And after that, Hazel had become the one who kept the kitchen running and the budget calculated and the household from falling apart while her father dreamed his careful dreams on brown paper. When he died, she had already been making decisions for so long that stopping felt more impossible than continuing. She found the plot without much trouble. 160 acres of flat grassland 40 minutes outside a small town called Harlan Creek. There was nothing on it, not a fence post, not a structure of any kind, just grass in every direction and a low hillside to the east that barely deserved the word. A neighbor named Sven Lindqvist came to help her build the dugout. He lived 3 miles north, and he came not because he particularly liked her, but because that was how things worked on the Nebraska frontier in those years. You helped because someday you would need help back. He was a Swedish man, somewhere in his 60s, with sharp blue eyes and an economy of words that Hazel came to respect over the 11 days it took to cut into the hillside and shore up the walls with timber and sod and build something that could be called, if you were being generous, a home. When Sven left, Hazel stood at the entrance of the dugout and looked at it, 14 feet wide, 12 feet deep, ceiling low enough that she had to be careful standing up too fast. One window, a small rectangle of greased paper that let in gray, watery light. The floor was hard-packed dirt. She carried her things inside and put her mother's quilt on the narrow cot in the corner and didn't cry. She had given herself permission to cry exactly once, at her father's graveside in Council Bluffs. She had used that permission. She did not intend to spend another one. Hazel Pruitt was 22 years old, and she was built the way some women were built in those days, large and solid, her frame broad at the shoulder and wide through the hip, her hands already rough from years of kitchen work and now rougher still from the work of the frontier. She was not small, and she had never pretended to be. The women in her mother's family had all been built this way, big-boned and capable. And her mother had told her once that a woman who could carry her own weight through the world was worth more than one who could not. And Hazel had held on to that. She had needed to hold on to it because the world had a great many opinions about the size of a woman's body, and very few of them were kind. Harlan Creek had opinions. Harlan Creek was a small town, and small towns ran on opinions the way other things ran on water. And the opinion of Hazel Pruitt was formed quickly and without much investigation. She was the large woman who lived alone in the dugout east of the creek, the one whose father had died before he could build anything proper, the one whose brother had gone back to Missouri and never written a hod. She was an object of a particular kind of pity that had contempt running underneath it, the kind of pity people offered to someone they had already decided could not succeed, so that when the failure came, they could say they had seen it coming. She heard the things they said, not always, not every word, but enough. She learned to walk through Harlan Creek with her eyes on the ground in front of her, and her face arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. She learned to put coins on a counter without waiting for the transaction to be acknowledged. She learned to hear laughter behind her back and keep walking, not because she did not feel it, but because feeling it and stopping to address it were two different things. And stopping cost energy she needed for other purposes. She built the clay oven herself. This was not something she had read about or been taught. It came to her one morning in her first autumn when the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight, and she woke with her breath making small clouds above her face and thought, simply and practically, that she needed to hold heat differently than the small fireplace Sven had helped her build was capable of holding it. She spent 4 days building it. She mixed Nebraska clay with dry grass and sand, in proportions that her hands seemed to understand before her mind did, shaping the dome in careful layers, letting each layer cure before adding the next. The first version collapsed on the third day. She looked at what was left of it for a long moment. Then she knocked the remaining pieces down, carried the broken clay outside, and started again. The second version held. By the time she was 25, it had held through 3 Nebraska winters, and she had learned to read it the way some people read faces, by the color of the flame and the smell of the smoke and a sound it made when it had reached the temperature she needed. The bread had started as a matter of survival. She needed to eat, and flour was cheaper than most things, and bread kept better than most things, and if she was going to spend 3 days a week baking, she might as well bake enough to sell. The first loaves she had taken to Clem Warbeck's store had not been the product of genius. They had been the product of trial and error and the specific attention of someone who had nothing else to give to a problem, and so gave it everything. Clem Warbeck ran the general store in Harlan Creek with the careful measuring eyes of a man who had spent 30 years deciding what things were worth. He was heavy-set with a red face and a tolerance for almost nothing he considered sentimental. The first time Hazel walked in with a wrapped loaf and proposed he sell it for her, he had looked at her the way you looked at someone who did not quite understand how the world worked. But he had cut a thin slice and eaten it, and spent a long moment looking out the window at the street. Then he had turned back and offered 40%. She had said 30. They had settled at 35. She had been supplying him for 2 years by the September of 1874, and the arrangement had made her life possible in the precise way that 35% of the sale price of 3 to 5 loaves a week could make a life possible, which was to say, barely but genuinely, what Hazel had not anticipated. When she walked into Clem Warbeck's store on a September morning in 1874 with 2 loaves wrapped in clean cloth, was that a man named Amos Calloway would walk in 12 minutes after her and stop in the middle of the store and stand there for 3 full seconds doing nothing at all. She did not see it happen. She had already conducted her business and was heading back to her wagon when Clem's voice followed her out, sharp and carrying, addressed to someone behind her. She did not turn around. She had learned not to turn around unless she had reason to. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and clicked to her old gray mare and drove back out of town the way she had come. The man who had stopped in the middle of Clem Warbeck's store was 32 years old and had been ranching the land south of Harlan Creek for 6 years. He was tall in the way of men who had done physical labor long enough that height became something structural rather than genetic, and he wore the clothes of a working rancher without any performance in them. Canvas and leather and road dust and the kind of boots that had been resoled twice. His name was Amos Calloway, and if you asked anyone in Harlan Creek to describe him, they would use the same word eventually. After they had tried a few others and found them insufficient, the word was steady. He had come into the store for salt and fence wire. He was walking toward the counter when the smell stopped him. It was not dramatic. He could not have explained it in words that would have satisfied anyone. It was bread, fresh bread. The smell of it in the air of that cluttered store was so specific and so unexpected that he stopped walking and stood there for 3 seconds, which was long enough for Clem Warbeck to appear at the counter and give him the look he gave to anyone who tracked mud across his floor. Amos moved to the mat near the door and scraped his boots and came back. He asked about the smell. Clem told him about the Pruitt woman, the one who lived in the dugout east of the creek, the one whose father had died before he could build anything. Amos looked at the 2 loaves wrapped in cloth on the counter behind Clem. He bought one without asking the price. That evening, he sat on the porch of his ranch house with his dog Buck, sprawled across his boots, and ate most of the loaf before he understood what he was doing. He had cut a thick slice, the way you did when you were not expecting much, planning to eat it quickly and get back to the account books he had left on the table. He did not get back to the account books for a long time. There was something in the bread that he could not name and could not locate in any specific ingredient or technique. Something that existed in the difference between a thing done correctly and a thing done with actual attention. He sat on that porch until the light failed completely and ate bread and thought about a woman he had never met who had somehow put that quality into something as ordinary as flour and water and heat. Buck watched him with the focused patience of a dog who understood that food was being consumed nearby and had formed a firm opinion about this. He went back to the store the following Saturday and bought the remaining loaf. He asked Clem more questions than the situation strictly required. He asked about how long she had been out there and whether she had any family and what else she sold. Clem answered without particular interest and then gave him a look that suggested he had noticed the quantity of questions and had formed an opinion about them. Amos paid and left. Over the following week, he asked other people. He asked Doris at the post office, who told him the woman received almost no mail and that her father's death had been a terrible thing and that the girl was too stubborn for her own good, living out there alone like she had something to prove. He asked old Sven Lindqvist, who had helped her build the dugout, and Sven looked at him with those sharp blue eyes and said simply that she worked harder than most men he knew and that if Amos was working up to feeling sorry for her, he should stop now because she did not need it and would not want it. Amos said it was not that. Sven looked at him for another moment and then turned back to what he was doing. It was not that. Amos understood this clearly even if he could not have articulated it well. He was not drawn by pity. Pity was a simple emotion, and what he felt was not simple. He had been ranching this land for 6 years, and he had learned in that time to pay attention to evidence, to look at what a thing actually was rather than what he expected it to be. And the bread was evidence of something, of a level of attention that was not common, of someone who was doing something as ordinary as baking bread and treating it like it mattered down to the smallest detail. He wanted to understand that. He wanted to see where it came from. He rode to the dugout on a morning in late September. It took him 40 minutes, and he thought for most of the ride about what he was going to say and could not produce anything that sounded fully honest. He knew the route, east of the creek past the bend where the cottonwoods grew thick, up along the low hillside. He found the entrance cut into the slope and framed with dark timber, a small clay chimney poking out of the ground a few feet back, a wagon out front with a gray mare tied to a post. He sat on his horse at the bottom of the slope for a moment and examined what he was doing. He was a grown man who had spent 2 weeks asking half the town about a woman he had never met because she made bread that he could not stop thinking about. He thought about turning around. Then he heard, from behind the dugout door, someone humming, a low, unconscious sound, the kind a person made when they were alone and did not know they were making it. He dismounted and tied his horse and knocked. The humming stopped. A pause. Footsteps. The door opened. The woman who stood in the doorway was not what he had assembled in his imagination from the fragments of other people's descriptions. She was close to his height, which surprised him. He had built some vague idea of smallness from the cautious pity in people's voices. Her frame was broad and solid, the kind of build that came from years of real work rather than circumstance, and she carried it without apology. Her hair was dark and pulled back roughly with a few strands loose around her face. She wore a flour-dusted apron over a dress the color of turned earth. Her eyes were brown and sharp and looking at him with an expression that was not hostility but was not warmth either. She had a wooden spoon in her right hand and a particular quality of stillness that suggested she was not startled, that she had heard him coming and had decided before she opened the door what her response would be. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was level. It was not unfriendly, but it was not offering anything extra. That surprised him a second time. Udo Harlan Creek is not a large town, Mr. Calloway. She did not move from the doorway. He had prepared several explanations on the ride over, and none of them felt sufficient now that he was standing in front of her, and she was looking at him with those eyes that were doing what he suspected they always did, which was assess the actual situation rather than the presented one. He said the true thing. "I bought your bread, both loaves that Clem Warbeck had. I wanted to see where they came from." She studied him the way you studied a fence line to find where it was weak. Then she stepped back from the doorway, not exactly inviting him in, but creating enough space that the invitation was present if he was paying attention. "I am in the middle of something," she said. But you can come in if you want to stand in a corner and not be in the way." He stood in the corner. The dugout was smaller than he had imagined and better organized than he would have thought possible in that space. Everything had a place. The tools on their hooks, the jars in their rows, the blankets folded on the narrow cot with a precision that looked habitual rather than performed. The floor was swept hard-packed dirt, clean enough to say something about the woman who maintained it. The ceiling was low, and he felt the instinct to duck even where there was room. And against the back wall, taking up nearly a third of the space, was the oven. He had expected something rough. What he saw was a structure that had been built by someone who had thought carefully about every aspect of it. A clay dome rising from a curved base with a surface that had gone dark and smooth from years of use. The opening at the front shaped in a careful arch. A small fire burned inside it, the orange light moving against the clay walls. "You built that yourself," he said. "Yes." She was at the work table in the center of the room, working dough with both hands and not looking at him. "How?" She glanced at him briefly, looked at a few adobe walls once, read what I could find, made the rest up as I went. A pause, her hands still moving. First version collapsed, second one held. "What did you do with the first one?" She looked at him directly for the first time since he had come inside, knocked it down and started over. The fire in the oven popped softly. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in that low, constant way of the Nebraska plains, more a feeling than a sound. He stayed for almost 2 hours, though he could not afterward account fully for how that happened. One moment he was standing in the corner feeling the awkwardness of a situation he had created by arriving uninvited, and then somehow they were talking. Not about anything significant at first. The weather. The price of flour at Clem Warbeck's store, which had gone up, and which Hazel mentioned with a flat practicality that suggested she had already calculated exactly how it affected her margins. She was direct in a way he was not accustomed to. When he said something imprecise, she corrected him without hesitation. When she disagreed, she said so without the cushioning that most people used. He found himself paying closer attention than he usually bothered with, tracking the logic of what she said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. And at some point, she pulled a small, misshapen loaf from the oven, a test batch for a new flour ratio she was working on, and cut it without asking whether he wanted any, and put a piece near him on the table the way you put water out for someone who had come a long way. He ate it. The crust crackled exactly right. The inside was denser than her usual loaves from the changed ratio, and even in this rougher form it had that quality he had been trying to name for 2 weeks. Something that existed in the presence of actual attention. "This is different," he said. "More rye than usual. I'm trying to make it hold longer in the cold. The wheat goes stale faster." She was looking at the bread critically, tearing a piece and chewing slowly. "Too heavy on the bottom. I need to adjust the heat distribution. It tastes good." "Good is not the goal," she said. She set the piece down. "Good enough to sell. Good enough to last. Good enough to make it to spring." He looked at her. She was already turning back to the oven, adjusting the damper with a practiced hand. He thought about the word enough and how it sounded differently when she said it, not as a settling for less, as a very specific and serious thing she was working toward with all of herself. Before he left, he asked if he could come back. She looked at him with that measuring expression. "You're going to keep buying my bread, yes. Then there is no reason you would need to come out here." "I would like to see how the rye loaf turns out," he said. A pause. The fire popped. "Come on a Thursday," she said finally. "I bake Thursdays." He rode home through the late afternoon with the smell of the dugout still in his jacket and Buck running alongside the horse. Fenwick Gould, his hired hand, was fixing a saddle on the fence rail when Amos came into the yard and gave him the look of someone who had noticed the direction of his employer's morning ride and had assembled an opinion about it. Everyone called him Fen, and he answered to it without complaint. "You go east," Fen said. Amos dismounted and handed the reins off without answering. Fen was 23 years old and cheerful in the particular way of people who had not yet had enough difficult things happen to them to learn the value of quiet. He had an instinct for other people's business that he exercised without self-consciousness, and a good heart that made most people forgive him for it eventually. The man who said nothing at all was Harlow Seck, the other hand on the Callaway Ranch. Harlow was 45 years old and built like a fence post and had an economy of expression that Amos had come to read as carefully as other people read words. A single nod from Harlow meant something. The absence of a nod meant something else. He had been with Amos for 4 of the 6 years, and Amos trusted his judgment on horses and timber and weather and most things that mattered. Amos came on Thursday. He came on the Thursday after that. He came on a Tuesday once when he had been riding the eastern fence line, and the route had taken him close enough that not stopping would have been a deliberate choice. He knocked, and Hazel opened the door and looked at him and said, "It is not Thursday." He said he knew. She stepped aside and let him in. The town started talking because the town always started talking. Harlan Creek was the kind of place where patterns got noticed, and patterns involving Amos Calloway got noticed faster than most, because he was the kind of man whose movements meant something in the way that steady men's movements always meant something in small communities. He had land and a reputation, and he had been alone for 6 years, and everyone who had been paying attention was aware that this made him, in some loose, unspoken way, the subject of ongoing community interest. Doris at the post office mentioned his eastern rides to a woman named Martha, who mentioned it to her husband, who mentioned it at the barber shop. And within 2 weeks, the shape of the thing had been assembled by the community through its usual method of partial observation and confident inference. People were not sure what kind of arrangement it was. The most charitable interpretation was that he felt sorry for her. The least charitable interpretations were various and ran the full range of what a small town could produce when it had decided something was unusual and therefore suspicious. Nobody asked Amos directly. He was not the kind of man you asked directly about personal matters, not because he was frightening, but because he had a quality of stillness that made such questions feel like a kind of intrusion. Nobody asked Hazel either, but for different reasons. She moved through Harlan Creek on her occasional trips to town like a woman who existed on a different frequency from the social life of the place. Not unfriendly, just elsewhere. What the town had decided, in its efficient and unsentimental way, was that whatever was happening between Amos Calloway and the Pruitt woman was either charity or foolishness, and either way, it would resolve itself by spring. The town was wrong about the timeline. It was wrong about most of the rest of it, too. What almost nobody noticed, because almost nobody was paying attention to Hazel Pruitt in the way that required noticing small things, was that she had started putting 2 cups on the table on Thursday mornings. Not dramatically, not as a declaration. She simply put them there, the same way she banked the fire and checked the flour supply and did the other practical things that kept the morning running. The second cup sat there, and when Amos arrived, it was filled and placed near where he sat, and nothing was made of it by either of them. What almost nobody noticed either, because it was the kind of thing that only mattered if you were paying attention to the interior logic of a very small room, was that the single wooden chair in the dugout had moved. It had lived for 3 years against the east wall, beneath the row of hanging tools, practical and out of the way. By the 3rd Thursday of October, it had migrated, incrementally and without announcement, to a position closer to the center of the room. Not dramatically closer, just closer. The way things moved when the arrangement of a space was changing to accommodate something that had not been there before. Hazel did not notice this, or rather, she noticed it in the way you notice the particular creaking of a floorboard you had stopped paying attention to, as a thing that had simply become part of the normal condition of the place. It was only much later, on the kind of evening when you found yourself accounting for things you had not meant to account for, that she would understand what the chair had been doing, what she understood in the moment. On a Thursday at the end of October, when the first real cold had come down off the plains and the light was leaving the sky by 4 in the afternoon, was that she was looking forward to Thursday in a way she had not looked forward to things in a long time. Not with the bright, sharp edge of excitement, which was an emotion she had learned to be cautious with because of what it cost you when it did not pay out. Something quieter than that. More like an orientation. The week had a direction now. Thursday was the direction. She did not examine this too carefully. She had other things to examine. She had 35% of the sale price of several loaves of bread to account for, and a clay oven that she had noticed was developing a hairline crack in the back left corner, and a gray mare who had been favoring her left foreleg for 3 days and needed attention she had not yet figured out how to give her. Hazel Pruitt was a practical woman, and she was very good at finding practical things to look at when the alternative was looking at something she did not yet know how to name. The morning Constance Merrill spoke to her outside Clem Warbeck's store was a Wednesday in the middle of November, the kind of cold, bright day that announced winter with absolute clarity and no particular sympathy. Constance Merrill was the wife of the largest landowner in the county after Amos himself, and she was a woman who had learned early in life that social position was a resource to be managed carefully, like any other resource, and that the management of it sometimes required direct intervention. She was standing outside the store when Hazel came around the corner, and the look on her face carried something in it that Hazel recognized from years of practice reading looks. It was the look of someone who had decided to be gracious about something they found distasteful. "Miss Pruitt," Constance said, "there is something I think it would be kind to mention." She glanced around the street. A practice check. "About Amos Calloway. He is a good man. Everyone in the county thinks highly of him." She paused for exactly the right length of time, which is why I think it is worth being honest with you, woman to woman, that what looks like interest from a man in his position is not always what it appears. Sometimes a man is simply lonely. And loneliness can cause him to behave in ways that give a woman the wrong impression about his intentions. Monte. The words had been arranged carefully. They had been thought about. Hazel looked at her steadily and said nothing for a moment. "Then I appreciate your concern. Was there something you needed from the store?" Constance blinked. Something in her face adjusted. "You are a very direct person, Miss Pruitt. I find it saves time." Hazel shifted her basket to her other arm. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Merrill." She went into the store. She bought what she needed. She did not let her hand tremble until she was back on the wagon and 3 minutes down the road where no one could see. Then she let it tremble for exactly 1 minute, which was her policy on that sort of thing. The trembling was not from fear. It was from the particular shock of hearing someone else say out loud the exact thing you had been telling yourself quietly in the middle of the night. The thing you had been managing and containing and trying not to look at too directly because looking at it directly made it harder to dismiss. A man in his position does not mean what you think he means. She had been living with a version of that thought for weeks. Having it said by someone else, in daylight, on a public street, in the particular tone of gracious condescension that Constance Merrill had perfected, made it larger and harder to contain. She drove back to the dugout through the cold, gray afternoon and went inside and stood in the middle of the room. The oven held its low fire. Buck was asleep near the door, having arrived that morning as he now did on most mornings, apparently having decided that the dugout was an acceptable extension of his territory regardless of whether Amos was present. The chair sat in the center of the room. Hazel looked at the chair for a long moment. Then she crossed to it and pushed it back against the east wall, beneath the hanging tools, where it had lived for 3 years before any of this had started. She stood back and looked at the room. The proportions felt wrong. The room looked like it had before, and before was not how it looked anymore. And the difference between the two was something she was not prepared to account for on a Wednesday afternoon in November, with Constance Merrill's carefully arranged words still sitting in her chest like a stone. She left the chair against the wall and went to tend the oven and told herself she was not going to think about it further. She was not particularly successful at this. Buck woke up and looked at the chair and then looked at her, and then put his chin back down on his paws with the resignation of a dog who understood that humans sometimes made decisions that did not make immediate sense, but who had learned to wait them out. Outside, the November wind moved across the Nebraska plains in long, cold pulls that smelled of frost and distance and the particular emptiness of a season that had settled in and was not going anywhere for a while. Inside, the oven held its heat. The crack in the back left corner was still there, waiting for her attention. The bread for Thursday was already planned in her head, the ratios calculated, the timing worked out. She was still here. She had not collapsed. But for the first time since she had come to this piece of Nebraska ground and carved a room out of a hillside and decided that this was where she was going to make her life. Still, here did not feel like enough. She slept badly that night, not with the dramatic restlessness of someone in crisis, but with the quiet, fractured sleep of someone whose mind had decided it was not finished with a problem and was going to work on it regardless of what the body needed. She woke twice before dawn, lay still in the dark listening to the wind outside and the low settling sounds of the oven cooling, and thought about the chair against the wall. She did not move it back. She told herself this was because she was tired. She told herself a number of things in those hours before light that she did not entirely believe. Thursday came the way Thursdays had been coming for 2 months now, with a particular quality of morning light that she had started to recognize before she was fully awake. She built the fire in the oven and started the first batch and put 2 cups on the table, and then stood looking at the 2 cups for a moment and did not move either of them. Some decisions were made without being made. She understood that about herself. The crack in the back left corner of the oven was worse than she had thought. She had been monitoring it for 3 weeks, watching the hairline spread with the slow patience of something that had all the time in the world and knew it. It was not catastrophic yet, but yet was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. She was crouched at the back of the oven with a candle, examining the crack, when she heard Buck scratch at the door. She let him in without getting up. He went to his spot near the base of the oven and circled twice and settled. 20 minutes later, she heard hooves she recognized, heavier than most, a particular rhythm she had learned without intending to. She was still crouched at the back of the oven when Amos knocked. He came in and stopped when he saw her position and did not say anything immediately. He looked at the crack she was examining and looked at her face and read what he found there the way she had come to understand he read most things, with attention and without rushing to fill the silence with something that would have been less useful than the silence. "How bad?" he said. She described it. The length of the crack, the depth as far as she could tell, the way it had spread in the last week. He listened without interrupting, which she had noticed was something he did consistently and which she had come to value more than she expected. Most people listened with half their attention and spent the other half preparing what they were going to say next. Amos listened as though the information actually mattered and as though he intended to use it. "The corner section might hold if I patch from the inside," she said. "New clay. 4 days before I fire again. Can you do it before the temperature drops further? If I start tomorrow?" She sat back on her heels and looked at the crack and felt the particular frustration of someone who had built a thing well and was watching time do to it, what time did to everything, which was find the places where the stress had accumulated and make them known. "I hate this," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. "When something I built breaks and I do not know right away if I can fix it." "That is not specific to ovens," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "No, it is not." He sat down in the chair. She noticed immediately which chair he sat in, not because there was more than one, but because of where it was. Against the east wall, beneath the hanging tools, a foot further from the center of the room than it had been every other Thursday for 2 months. He sat in it without comment, without any indication that he had registered the change, though she was quite sure he had registered the change because he registered most things. They sat with the information between them, the cracked oven and the moved chair and the cold coming in around the edges of the door, and neither of them addressed any of it directly. They talked about the weather and the state of the road and whether the creek had frozen along the edges yet. Practical things, the kind of conversation she had told herself she wanted them to have. It was not until Clem Warbeck stopped her 2 days later on her delivery that the practical situation became complicated in a different way. Clem was a man who dealt in facts, and he delivered this one without preamble. He had received a letter from a supply company out of Omaha. They were offering a regular bread supply, machine-produced, consistent quantity, lower price per unit than what Hazel was providing. He had 30 days to decide. He looked at her across the counter with those careful, measuring eyes. "If you can give me 10 loaves a week instead of 5, he said, "and add something new, something I cannot get from a machine, I choose you. But I need to know your oven is going to hold." She looked at him. She thought about the crack in the back left corner. "My oven will hold," she said. She said it with the steadiness of someone who had decided something rather than someone who knew something for certain. Clem held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, which was his version of a contract, and she picked up her basket and walked out. She did not tell Amos about the deadline. This was a deliberate choice, though she would not have called it that at the time. She would have said she simply had not gotten around to mentioning it, which was true in the narrow sense and untrue in the broader one. The truth was that the problem was hers, and she needed to solve it herself before she could talk about it. Because talking about a problem she had not yet solved felt too much like asking for help with something she had not yet established she could handle, and she had spent 3 years learning that the only reliable thing was what she could do herself. She started patching the crack the next morning in the cold, dark hour before full light. She mixed the clay by feel more than measure, working it in her hands until it had the right resistance, the specific weight that told her it would hold under heat. She worked in layers the way she had built the original, letting each cure before adding the next. She kept the fire at barely above coals to maintain the temperature of the clay without shocking it. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check the fire in the patch, feeding it by feel in the dark with Buck breathing against her ankle through all of it. Fen arrived on Thursday with Amos, which was unusual. Amos had brought timber that week, cut from the ranch supply, because the frame around the dugout door had gone soft with moisture and winter was coming, and a door that did not seal properly in a Nebraska winter was not a small problem. He had mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Examining the frame with a practiced eye, she had said she would get to it. He had said he had timber at the ranch. She had said she did not need it. He had said she could pay him in bread if it bothered her to take it otherwise. She had said that was not a fair trade. He had said they could argue about fair when the door did not fall off. She had not argued further, which was itself a kind of answer. Fen worked with the bright physical energy of someone who had not yet learned that not every moment required commentary. He tried to be helpful in the way that young men tried to be helpful when they wanted to be noticed being helpful, which was with a great deal of visible effort and not always with efficiency. Harlow Sec had not come, which Hazel understood meant Amos had judged this a 2-person job that could accommodate a third. She appreciated the precision of that judgment, even if she did not say so. She worked alongside them from the start. There was no version of this in which she stood back and watched other people do work on her home, and she had not pretended otherwise. She handed tools, held timber in place while Amos drove the nails, pointed out where the rot had spread further than it looked from the outside. Amos worked without directing her, which she noticed. He treated her presence as a given rather than a complication, and this was not a small thing. Fen, at some point in the middle of the morning, looked around at the dugout entrance and the hillside and the flat winter prairie in every direction and said, with the genuine puzzlement of someone trying to understand a life that was not his, living out here alone. He said, "It must get real lonely, ma'am." She did not look up from the board she was holding. "Lonelier with the wrong company than with none at all," she said. Fen went quiet. Amos looked at the doorframe and drove a nail and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to add to that. When the frame was done and the door hung level, she tested it twice, running her hand along the edges, checking the seal. "Good," she said, to no one specifically, to the door. She went inside and came back with a loaf, already sliced so that Fen could have a piece for the ride back without anyone needing to ask. Fen ate his before they had gotten 50 yards from the entrance. She could hear him telling Amos it was the best thing he had eaten all week, which was probably true and also probably not very meaningful given what Fen's week typically contained. She watched them ride south from the entrance of the dugout until they were shapes against the November sky, and then nothing. Buck sat beside her and they both looked at the empty landscape for a moment. The door behind her sealed properly for the first time in months. The oven inside was holding. The crack was patched and she was in the 3rd day of the curing process, and she was fairly confident it would hold. Though confident and certain were different things, and she had stopped confusing them years ago. She had 4 days until the 30-day deadline Clem Warbeck had given her. She had a new flour ratio she had been developing for 6 weeks that she believed was ready, though believing something was ready and knowing it was ready were also different things. The rolled bread she had been working on, folded in a specific way that created a layered internal structure, was as close to right as she had gotten it. She needed it to hold texture through a full day in a coat pocket in cold weather. She had tested 3 versions. The 4th was better. On the 4th morning, she ran a full heat cycle through the patched oven and watched the crack site for 3 hours without moving from her stool. It held. She fired it twice more over the next 2 days with the same result. On the 5th morning, she baked. She delivered 10 loaves to Clem Warbeck on the 30th day and set 6 of the rolled bread pieces on the counter beside them. Clem examined the loaves with his professional eye and then looked at the rolls with an expression she could not immediately read. "What are these? Something new." She kept her voice level. "They hold their texture in cold. A man can carry one in his coat pocket all day and it will still be worth eating by evening." Clem picked one up and pulled it apart slowly and looked at the cross-section and then ate it in 2 bites and stood looking at the counter for a long moment. His expression did not change. His expressions rarely did. "The Omaha people use machines," he said finally. "Yes," he looked at her. "They cannot make this with a machine. No." Another pause. He picked up a loaf and turned it over in his thick hands, the way he had that first morning 2 years ago, examining it with the careful attention of a man whose opinion of things was formed by evidence rather than expectation. Then he set it down. "I choose you," he said. She walked out of the store and stood beside her wagon in the cold November air. The street of Harlan Creek was quiet at that hour, the wooden storefronts casting long shadows in the thin winter light. She put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the sky, which was that particular gray of late November in Nebraska, flat and close and not promising anything. She had solved the problem. The oven had held. The deadline had been met. The arrangement would continue, and she would have enough to see her through the winter and into the spring, which was what she had needed and what she had worked toward for 30 days without sleeping properly or eating particularly well or telling a single person what was at stake. And she stood there in the cold and felt the particular smallness of a victory that had no one to tell it to. In 3 years of solving problems alone, she had gotten very good at taking quiet satisfaction in her own competence, at treating success as its own sufficient reward. But standing beside that wagon with the cold coming through her coat and the sound of Harlan Creek going about its business around her, she understood for the first time the difference between being sufficient and being full. She had been sufficient for a long time. She had not noticed that sufficient and full were different until she felt the gap between them. She rode to the Callaway Ranch. It was not Thursday. She had not planned to go. She went because the wagon was already pointed south, and because she was tired of the particular weight of carrying things alone, and because she had spent 30 days not telling someone something, and she was finished with that. Amos was in the yard when she arrived, checking the legs of his roan with the focused attention of a man who had been worried about something, and was checking whether his worry had been justified. He looked up when she came through the gate, and his face did the thing it did when he was trying to read a situation before committing to a response, which was become very still. She told him about Clem Warbeck and the Omaha Company and the 30-day deadline. She told it plainly, the way she told most things, in the order it had happened without editorializing. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Were you surprised?" "No. Neither was I." They stood in the yard in the cold afternoon, and the words sat between them and were enough. She had not needed him to tell her she had done well, had not needed the kind of enthusiastic acknowledgement that some people needed from others to make their accomplishments real. What she had needed was simply that someone who knew what it had cost her should know that it had worked. That was different. That was something she was only beginning to understand she had been missing. Fen appeared from the direction of the barn, with the slightly too casual air of someone who had noticed something interesting and was trying to observe it without appearing to observe it. He said something about fence posts that did not require a response and disappeared again. Harlow did not appear at all, which was Harlow's version of giving people privacy. She did not stay long. There was bread to plan for the new order and a ration of daylight left that she needed to use. But she rode back to the dugout with something shifted in the arrangement of things inside her. Something small and not fully articulated but present in the way that things were present when they were true. The week had a direction. The direction was still Thursday. But she had ridden south on a Wednesday because she wanted to, not because she needed to. And that was not the same thing at all. The Thursday that changed things came 2 weeks later. It was the kind of cold by then that settled into the ground itself. The frost going 2 feet down, and the prairie grass gone stiff and pale, and the sky a white that gave no warmth. Amos arrived and came in and sat in the chair, which was against the wall where she had left it on the Wednesday when Constance Merrill had said the thing she had said. And he sat in it without comment, the way he had been sitting in it for the 2 Thursdays since, in the position that was less convenient, further from the table, where he had to angle slightly to see what she was doing at the oven. He drank his coffee. She worked the dough. They talked about the creek, which had frozen solid, and about the herd and the north pasture and the state of the winter feed supply. Normal things, the kind of conversation she had decided was the right kind to have. About 40 minutes in, he set his cup down and looked at her with the particular quality of attention he used when he had decided to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "Something happened," he said. She kept her hands in the dough. Nothing happened. The chair moved. Furniture does not have a permanent position. Hazel. She stopped working. The fire in the oven ticked and popped. Buck lifted his head from his spot by the wall and looked between them and then put it back down. She told him about Constance Merrill. She had not planned to. She told it plainly, without dramatizing it, the way she told things she wanted to be understood without being made into more than they were. The words Constance had used, the tone, the specific quality of concern that had condescension running underneath it like a current under ice. Amos listened to all of it. His face did not do much. She had come to understand that this was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, that the stillness was where the feeling went when he was taking something seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "This past month," he said, "I wrote a letter to a woman in Salina. Her name is Cecily Frayne. Our families had an understanding going back some years. Nothing formal, nothing agreed, but a direction that people on both sides had taken for granted." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I wrote to tell her there was not going to be a direction anymore." She held still. "I did this 6 weeks after I first came here," he said, "before I knew what you would say about any of it, before I knew if you would say anything at all." The fire in the oven breathed quietly. Outside, the wind moved over the frozen ground with that particular winter sound, more like pressure than noise. She said, "You did that because you were certain or because you were hoping?" He took a breath, and she recognized what he was doing, which was making sure he was going to say the right thing rather than the ready thing. "Because I was being honest," he said. "I could not have written that letter after asking you something. It would have been a transaction." He paused. "I did not want it to be a transaction." She looked at him. She looked at the oven. She looked at her hands, which were still in the dough. She thought about what it meant that he had made a decision that carried real risk before he had any evidence that the risk was worth taking, that he had acted on something before he could know the outcome, which was the only kind of action that actually told you anything about a person, because it was the only kind that could not be performed for an audience. She had been waiting for the trick. She had been waiting for 3 months for the thing underneath the thing to reveal itself, for the ledger she could not detect to become visible, for the evidence that the careful kindness had a motive she had not been able to see. She knew how to look for those things. She had been looking since the first Thursday. She had not found them. She stood up straight. She crossed the room to the chair against the east wall, and she picked it up and moved it back to the center of the room, to the position it had drifted to over 2 months of Thursdays before she had pushed it away. She set it down and stepped back and did not say anything. She went back to the oven and checked the draft and adjusted it and began working the dough again. Amos did not say anything either. He sat in the chair in the center of the room and finished his coffee, and they talked about other things. The new loaves she was developing, the way the rolled bread had come out in the second batch, whether she thought the ratio needed further adjustment, practical things, the kind of conversation she had told herself she wanted. But the chair was in the center of the room. It stayed there when he left. It stayed there through the evening and through the night, and when she woke the next morning it was the first thing she saw. And she looked at it and thought about a man who had made a decision before he knew the outcome and understood that this was, in the end, the only kind of evidence she knew how to trust. December came in without ceremony, the way the serious months always did in Nebraska. The chair was in the center of the room. That was the whole of the transition, one thing in its right place, and everything else adjusting around it. The Thursdays continued. They had a shape now that neither of them had designed, a rhythm that had established itself through repetition, the way most real things establish themselves, not through intention, but through the accumulation of small, consistent choices. He arrived mid-morning. She was usually in the middle of a bake cycle. Buck had already found his corner near the base of the oven and settled into it with the conviction of an animal that had made a permanent decision. 2 cups on the table, the chair in the center, and between them, in the hours that followed, the particular quality of conversation that happened between people who had stopped performing for each other and had not yet found anything to replace the performance with except honesty, which was harder but considerably lighter to carry. She told him things she had not told other people, not because she had decided to, not as a conscious act of trust, but because he listened in a way that made the telling feel less like exposure and more like thinking out loud, which was something she had been doing alone for 3 years and had not understood she missed until she had someone to do it with. He told her things in the same way, in pieces, not organized explanations, but fragments that came naturally out of the conversation, one thing leading to another without ceremony. She learned that the second winter on the ranch had been worse than the first, that he had come close to losing the herd twice and had not told anyone because asking for help had felt at the time like an admission that the whole enterprise had been a mistake. She recognized that reasoning the way you recognized your own handwriting. It was in the second week of December that Amos arrived on a morning that was not Thursday with Timber in the wagon bed. He had said nothing in advance about this. He came in and told her he had been looking at the north corner of the dugout ceiling where the sod met the timber frame, and there was a gap there that was going to cause problems before the worst of winter arrived. He had timber. He was here. He could address it now, or she could freeze in January. Either worked for him. She looked at the gap she had been meaning to get to for 2 weeks and had not gotten to. She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who had prepared for an argument and was mildly disappointed to find it might not be necessary. "You are going to stand on the chair," she said. "It will hold me. If it does not, I will not replace it." He moved the chair to the corner and stepped up and packed the gap with the clay she handed him, and a quantity of dried dirt came down and settled on his shoulder and in the band of his hat, and he brushed it off without stopping. When he stepped down, the gap was gone, and he moved the chair back to the center of the room and sat in it and picked up the coffee she had not offered but had poured, and they did not make anything of it. Which was the only way she knew how to accept help that felt like it came from the right place. The new bread was working. She had made 4 test batches of the rolled loaves since October, and the 4th version was closer to right than anything she had produced before. The layered structure held its integrity through a full day of cold. She had sent a sample with Amos to give to Fenn and Harlow without explaining why, and 3 days later, Amos had reported that Fenn had eaten his in the field at midday and said it was the best thing he had taken out with him in 6 years of ranch work, and that Harlow had eaten his, which from Harlow was a more significant endorsement than it might have appeared. She adjusted the fold tension one more time in the 5th batch, and the bottom layer came out right, and she stood at the work table looking at the cross-section and thought about the day she had described this exact problem to Amos. And he had said she was thinking about people, and she had said she was thinking about bread, and they had both known which of them was right. What she understood in the days that followed was simpler and more unsettling than she expected. She had been running on the mathematics of survival for so long that she had forgotten survival was supposed to lead somewhere. The 30 days of the Omaha deadline had shown her what she could do under pressure. The ride south to tell Amos had shown her something else entirely, that the doing was no longer the whole point. Amos proposed the kitchen on a Thursday in the second week of December. He didn't do it dramatically. He sat in the chair and drank his coffee and said he had been thinking about the space she worked in and that he had lumber at the ranch that had been sitting since fall, and that he wanted to build her a proper kitchen, attached to the east side of the dugout so she could move between them without going outside, with a wood floor and real ventilation and enough room to work without the ceiling of her sleeping space sitting on top of her. She looked at him. "Not instead of," he said immediately. "Beside, this stays. I'm talking about giving you room to work." She set down the bowl she was holding and thought about the ceiling she had been ducking for 3 years and the way the oven's heat pooled in the low space and the window that gave her a gray, watery light that made it nearly impossible to read the true color of a crust without stepping outside. She had been solving around those limitations so long she had stopped noticing them as limitations. She had incorporated them into her technique the way you incorporated a bad knee into your gait, working with them rather than seeing them as the problem they actually were. "That is a significant thing to propose," she said. "I know it is. You're doing considerable work on property that is not yours." He looked at her steadily. "I'm aware of that." The words sat in the air between them and clarified in the silence after it what they were actually talking about, which was not timber and floor joists. She looked at the table. She looked at the oven. She looked at her hands. "Let me see the lumber first," she said. He nodded once. That was all. He did not expand the yes into something larger than what she had offered, did not take the opening and push it wider. He took what she had given and left room for the rest, and she was beginning to understand that this, more than anything else, was the thing about him that she did not know how to protect herself from, because you could not push against someone who was not pushing. Construction began in the first week of January when the ground had frozen solid enough to work on without the foundation shifting in thaw. Amos brought Fenn and Harlow and a wagon loaded with lumber that he had been selecting and preparing since fall. She saw this when she looked at the boards, the care with which they had been chosen and cut, and understood that he had been planning the dimensions for some time before he proposed it, which meant he had been thinking about what she needed before he said anything about it, which was another piece of evidence she added to the collection she had been building for 4 months. She worked alongside them from the first morning. There was no version of this in which she stood back and observed. She had specific requirements for the oven placement and the height of the work surfaces and the direction of the ventilation, and she communicated them without softening them or asking whether anyone minded. Harlow listened to her describe the oven she wanted and asked 2 questions and then built exactly what she described with the quiet precision of someone who understood that good work required accurate information and was not particular about where the information came from. Fenn offered alternative suggestions twice. Both times she looked at what he was proposing and explained, briefly and without meanness, why it would not serve the purpose. After the second time, he stopped offering alternatives and worked with a focus she had not previously seen from him, which she understood was his version of respect. Amos moved between them all, doing the physical work without calling attention to it, carrying the heavy timber, setting the frame, working the corners with a carpenter's eye that she had not known he had. He did not direct her. He did not offer her the easier tasks or suggest she rest or treat her presence as something to be managed. When she needed to hold a board, he held it. When she needed to work, he worked beside her. The arrangement of it was simple and exactly right, and she trusted simple and exactly right more than she trusted most things. 9 days. The structure was not beautiful in the way that finished things were beautiful. The boards did not match perfectly, and there was a gap near the north window that let in a thread of cold air, and the floor had a slight lean to the east that you could feel in your feet but could not see with your eyes. She noted every imperfection and found that she valued the structure more for them. Because a perfect thing would have felt like it belonged to someone else, and this belonged to her in the specific way that things built with actual attention in actual conditions belonged to the people who needed them. She built the oven herself over the 3 days after the structure was complete. Amos handed her things when she asked and stayed out of her way when she did not. She built it larger than the original by 18 inches in depth and shaped the interior with a precision she had been calculating for months. The specific geometry she had worked out in her head during all those nights when the limitations of the dugout oven had made her adjust her technique to compensate for what the structure could not do so. She built the oven she had actually wanted since the beginning, not the one she had been able to build in a hillside with what she had. When she fired it for the first time and the heat came off it in a slow, even wave that filled the room without hot spots, without the dead zones she had been working around for 3 years. She stood with both hands flat on the new work surface, the wide pine planks that were the right height for her height, and she was quiet for a long moment. Amos was in the doorway. He did not say anything. He looked at the oven and at her face, and his expression was the one she had the most difficulty with. Not warm exactly, because warm was too soft a word for it, but the look of someone who had helped something happen and was satisfied by that and did not need it to be about him. "It is right," she said. He nodded. "I can see that." She looked at him in the doorway of the kitchen she had just built in the structure he had brought timber for, and she said, "Thank you." She said it without the careful surrounding of practical language she usually put around things like that. Just the 2 words, meaning exactly what they meant. He said you did most of it. She said you brought 3 men in 9 days and told them exactly what to do with all of it. He came inside and looked at the oven properly, running his eye along the lines of it the way he checked things he wanted to understand rather than just see. He said, "This is yours. Hazel, I moved some materials around." She looked at him standing in the new kitchen that smelled of fresh pine and first smoke, and she understood that she had come to the end of the careful not saying, not because she had run out of patience for it, but because it had become its own kind of dishonesty, and she had no tolerance for dishonesty, including in herself. "I'm not good at this," she said. "I want you to know that before anything else, I do not know how to let someone be part of what I have built without feeling like I'm giving pieces of it away." She looked at the work surface, the wide planks of it already dusted with the first traces of flour from the morning's test batch. "I keep waiting for the cost I have not seen yet." He came a step closer, not crowding, just less far away. "There might be one," he said quietly. "I cannot promise there will not be. Things go wrong. That is not something I can protect you from." He was looking at her with the straightforward directness she had still not learned to be comfortable with. "What I can tell you is that I am not keeping a ledger. There is no account. I'm here because I want to be here. That is the whole of it." She looked at him. She thought about 4 months of Thursdays and timber and patched gaps and coffee that was always poured and never asked for, and a dog who had made his own decision about where he belonged, and a man who had ended something in Selena before he had any reason to believe it would matter. She thought about the chair in the center of the room. She thought about this day she had ridden south to tell someone about Clem Warbeck and the Omaha Company because a victory alone had felt smaller than it should have. "I believe you," she said. She said it the way she said things she had decided, not the way she said things she felt, because feeling and deciding were not the same, and she had learned to be clear about which one she was doing. Something shifted in his face, not surprise, relief, the specific relief of someone who had been holding a careful stillness for a long time and had been given permission to put it down. "Amos," she said. "Ask me." He went still. "Ask you what?" "You've been thinking about asking me something for 2 months." She met his eyes. "Ask it now." He was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet she had learned to trust, someone making sure they were going to say the true version rather than the available one. "Then I want to show you the ranch. Not today. When you are ready. I want you to see it before you make any decision about anything." He paused. "I want you to see what you would be deciding about." She looked at him for a long moment. The pine smell of the new kitchen, the heat from the oven that was right for the first time. Buck asleep in the corner he had claimed on the first day of construction. "Saturday," she said. "I will come on Saturday." He came for her on a Saturday morning in January with the sky the particular blue that only appeared between storms, sharp and cold and honest. They rode south on horseback because the wagon road was soft in places from a recent partial thaw, and Amos had judged horses the better choice, which she had agreed with without him needing to explain the reasoning. Buck ran alongside for the first mile and then made a private decision about the reasonableness of this and turned back. The ranch was larger than she had understood from his descriptions, not in acreage. She had known the acreage, but in character. The way the buildings sat in relation to each other and to the land had a particular quality that she recognized as the product of 6 years of a person paying attention to what worked and adjusting toward it. The fences were straight and maintained. The barn doors hung level and moved easily. The equipment she could see was in use, not rusting. These things told her what she needed to know about how a place was run when no one was watching, which was the only information that actually mattered. Fenn appeared from the direction of the barn and gave them both the look of someone who had been hoping for exactly this moment and was trying with limited success to appear casual about it. He said something about being glad she had come out, that the boss had been wanting to show her the place since about October, which earned him a look from Amos that he appeared to find entirely insufficient as a deterrent. Harlow came around the side of the barn, assessed the situation in one glance, and nodded at Hazel with the particular gravity of a man who communicated everything important in silence. She nodded back. This seemed to satisfy them both, and Amos showed her the property without narrating it. He let her look and answered questions when she had them, and did not fill the space between questions with commentary about his own work. She saw the herd in the south pasture. She saw the root cellar and the smokehouse and the arrangement of the bunkhouse. She saw the north pasture where he had lost a calf to the cold in November. The one he had told her about on a Thursday, with the particular quietness of someone reporting something that had cost them more than they wanted to show. Then he took her to the kitchen. It was as he had described it, and worse. The oven was positioned against the wrong wall for the morning light, and the ventilation was inadequate for the amount of heat it needed to produce, and the work surfaces were set at a height that would have been comfortable for a man 8 inches shorter than she was. The storage was haphazard in the way of spaces that had been organized by someone who thought of cooking as something that happened to food rather than something a person did with intention. There was no logic to where things were. There was no system. There was just a kitchen that functioned after a fashion and had never been asked to do better than that. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly and looked at all of it, and her mind began to do what it did when it encountered a problem it had already decided to solve, which was to reorganize the space in the way it should have been organized, to move the oven to the east wall where the morning light would come in and show her the true color of what was baking, to raise the work surfaces to the right height, to create a logic in the storage that would let her find what she needed without thinking about finding it. She was 3 steps into this process before she noticed she was doing it. She stopped, looked at Amos, who was standing in the doorway watching her with the expression she had the most difficulty with. "You knew I would do that," she said. "I hoped you would," he said. She looked at the kitchen again. She looked at the doorway he was standing in, the proportions of the room, the morning light coming through the east window. She thought about what it would mean to be in this room every day, to build something here that was hers in the way the dugout had been hers, Not because she owned the structure, but because she had put herself into it. "Hazel," he said. She looked at him. He came into the kitchen and stood near her. Not too close, but the distance between them had been changing for months, and what it was now was the distance between people who had stopped pretending there was more of it than there was. "I want you to come here," he said. "Not to visit, to stay. I want to marry you." She held his gaze. She looked at the kitchen. She looked back at him. "You brought me in here knowing I would see everything wrong with it," she said. "I brought you in here because it will be your kitchen. You should see it before you decide." He did not look away. "I'm not hiding anything from you. That is the only promise I know how to make with any certainty." She was quiet for a long moment. The cold light came through the east window and lay across the uneven floor. From somewhere outside, Fenn's voice rose briefly and was cut short, which suggested Harlow had intervened. "I am difficult to live with," she said. "I need to fix things myself before I can accept help with them. I will move the chair when I am frightened, and I will not always tell you when I am doing it. I'm not going to become someone easier. He said I have been watching you be exactly that person for 4 months, and I am asking you because of it, not in spite of it." "That is not a reassurance," she said. "That is just evidence. I know what I'm asking," he said. "I'm asking it on purpose." From outside, barely audible, Fenn's voice in a stage whisper, "Has he asked yet?" and Harlow's reply, flat and immediate, "Be quiet." She looked at him and did not need to run the whole accounting again. She had been running it for 4 months. The numbers had not changed, only her willingness to act on them had. "Yes," she said. He blinked, as though he had prepared carefully for the possibility of not yet, and yes had arrived ahead of schedule. "Yes," she said again. "Do not make me say it 3 times. Amos." He let out a breath. She watched the careful stillness of 4 months leave his shoulders. He reached out and took her hand, her flour-roughened, clay-stained, work-worn hand, and held it with the same directness he brought to everything. No performance, no theater, just a person choosing another person and letting that be what it was. Outside, Fenn said something that contained the words about time, and was immediately silenced by what sounded like Harlow's hand on his shoulder. They were married in April. On a morning when the cottonwoods along the creek had put out their first pale green, and the ground had finally given up the last of the winter frost, and the sky was the particular blue of a Nebraska spring that made you understand, briefly and completely, why people stayed in hard places. The ceremony took 30 minutes at the county judge's office. Clem Warbeck stood as witness with the expression of a man who had been present at a transaction he considered sound. Sven Lindqvist, who had helped her dig the original dugout into that hillside 11 days in the summer of 1871 and had not made a ceremony of it then, came now in his best coat and made no ceremony of this either. He shook Amos's hand afterward and looked at Hazel and said her father would have respected Calloway, which was the highest compliment Sven had in his vocabulary and the only one that would have meant what he intended. She held those words carefully. Fenn ate 4 slices of the wedding bread she had baked that morning and spent several minutes looking alarmed by his own feelings about it, which she found completely charming. Harlow ate 1 slice and nodded once, and that was the entirety of his contribution to the celebration, which was exactly right. The bread had taken 3 hours. It was the best thing she had ever made. She knew this while she was making it, and she knew it when she looked at it, and she knew it when she watched other people eat it. Some days the work came together in that way, when everything she had learned over years of attention came to bear on a single thing at the right moment. She let herself know it without diminishing it, which was something she was still learning to do. The move to the ranch happened over 2 weeks in early April. There was more to it than she had planned for. Not the physical carrying, which was finished in 2 trips, but the last day. When the dugout was empty and she stood at the entrance and understood that she was not sad and was not relieved, she was finished. The words sat in her chest with the particular weight of things that had been fully used. She had come here at 22 with a dead man's plan and a brother who had already turned back in a world that had contracted to the width of a wagon seat and 160 acres of flat grassland with nothing on it. She had cut a room into a hillside and built a fire and made bread in a clay oven she had built herself and figured out how to keep herself alive through 3 winters that asked everything she had and then asked again. The woman standing at this doorway was not the woman who had moved in. Same hands, same stubbornness, same absolute refusal to let a thing beat her if she had the option of not letting it. But the world had opened back up. Slowly, through choices she had made one at a time, and the dugout had held her while it happened, and she was grateful to it the way she was grateful to things that had done their work well and did not need her to make more of it than it was. Amos was waiting at the bottom of the slope with Buck and two of her boxes in his arms and the April sun behind him, watching her with the patience that was simply who he was. She pulled the door shut. She didn't look back at it. She took one of the boxes from his arms without asking, and they walked to the wagon together, and she didn't need to look back because she carried what the dugout had made her in her hands and in her spine and in the way she moved through the world. And that didn't require a backward glance to keep. By July, the kitchen at the ranch was different. She had repositioned the oven in the first week, which had required Fenn and Harlow and a quantity of effort that Fenn described afterward with great enthusiasm to anyone who would listen, and which had produced a result she could work with properly for the first time. She had rebuilt the work surfaces at the right height. She had organized the storage according to a logic that made sense to someone who actually used the space. Amos had watched all of this without interfering, which she did not take for granted. He came in one morning in the second week and looked at what she had done and said better. Then he poured his own coffee and sat at the table, and that was the end of it. She thought about how much that cost some men, to walk into a room they owned that had been rearranged without their input and say better and mean it. She thought about this without saying it and went back to her bread. Clem Warbeck increased the order to 12 loaves by August, and the rolled bread had a separate line in his stock with customers who came in specifically for it. He mentioned this to Hazel on a Wednesday delivery with the restrained satisfaction of a man trying not to admit he was pleased. She received it the same way, and they conducted their transaction with the mutual respect of people who had found an arrangement that worked and had no interest in making it sentimental. In August, Constance Merrill came into Clem Warbeck's store and bought a loaf. She mentioned to someone afterward that it was very good. This information traveled through Harlan Creek by its usual method and arrived back to Hazel in a form considerably embellished from the original, but the core of it was accurate. Hazel said nothing about it to anyone and baked the following morning's bread with the same attention she gave every morning's bread, which was all of it, which had always been all of it. By November, the kitchen smelled the way a kitchen should smell, of bread and fire and the specific warmth of a space that was used daily by someone who knew what they were doing in it. The new oven was everything the dugout oven had been working toward, everything she had been calculating in the back of her mind through 3 years of compensating for what she did not have. She stood at the work surface on a Tuesday morning in November and mixed the dough for the day's bake and thought about what it meant to work in a space that was the right size for what she actually was. It was exactly 1 year since Amos had stopped in the middle of Clem Warbeck's store for 3 seconds because of a smell. She didn't note this out loud. She noted it privately, the way she noted things that mattered, with a full accounting of what they had cost and what they had produced and whether the balance was what it should be. The balance was more than it should be. That was the honest answer. Amos came in from this yard that morning with mud on his boots and hay in his jacket and the look of a man who had been up since before light and had done the work that needed doing and had not thought about whether anyone was noticing. He sat at the table. She put the bread in front of him without asking, the way she had stopped asking for most things, because some things had simply become how the day ran. He ate. She sat across from him. The morning light came through the east window that she had insisted be widened in the second month, wide enough now to show her the true color of a crust without stepping outside, and it lay across the table between them in a stripe that was warm for November. "Good bread," he said. "I know," she said. He looked up at her, and she looked at him, and the small smile came the way his did, without preparation, because something had actually struck him as worth smiling at. She did not look away from it. 3 years ago she would have. She had gotten better at staying with things that were good. Buck had not moved from his position near the stove since October and showed no intention of revisiting the decision. Outside, the November sky went on in every direction the same as it always had, flat and honest and asking everything of whoever lived under it. Inside, the oven held its heat. The bread was done. The kitchen smelled of wood and fire and the particular morning that was this one and no other. 3 years before, she had built a clay oven in a hillside to survive a winter. She had not known that was a beginning. It had felt like the smallest possible version of a life she could fit herself into and still call living. She understood now, in the way you understood things that had taken years to become clear, that the smallest possible life and the foundation of something larger were sometimes the same thing, and that the difference between them was not the structure itself, but what you were willing to build on top of it. She had been willing, She had kept being willing. One Thursday at a time, one moved chair at a time, one decision made before she knew the outcome. That was all it had taken. That and the work, which had always been there, which had never left her, which had been the one constant through every winter and every loss and every morning. She had counted to 3 before getting up, because that was what you did when there was no other choice. She picked up her coffee and looked out the east window at the November morning and thought that she had not run out of winters yet, and that this one, unlike the ones before it, she was not facing alone. She had not run out of winters, but for the first time she was not counting toward the end of one. She was simply in it, with the fire behind her and the light in front of her and the bread on the table between them. And that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing.